Let me tell you a story that started like any other ordinary day, but turned into something I never expected. It all began on a crisp Monday morning, the kind where the air feels fresh and full of possibilities. I run a small construction business, not the biggest or fanciest, but it's mine, and I take pride in what we do. That day, my crew and I were working on renovating an old house down the street. It had been empty for years, and the new owner wanted to give it a fresh start. We were excited about the project because it seemed straightforward. Fix the roof, repaint the walls, update the plumbing. Nothing out of the ordinary. As the sun climbed higher, my team was deep into the work. The sound of hammers echoed through the quiet neighborhood, blending with the occasional chatter of birds. Everything felt peaceful, almost therapeutic. But then, just as we were getting into a rhythm, she appeared. Karen. She stormed onto the scene like a hurricane, her designer sunglasses perched on her nose, and a reusable coffee cup clutched in one hand. Her presence alone commanded attention, though not the good kind. She stopped near the edge of the property, planted her feet firmly, and shouted, "What on earth are you doing?" Her voice cut through the calm like a knife, making everyone freeze mid-task. I walked over to her, trying to stay polite. After all, this was her neighborhood too. "We're renovating the house," I explained calmly. "We have all the permits, and everything is approved." But Karen wasn't interested in hearing that. Instead, she launched into a tirade about how our work would ruin the look of her perfect little street. To her, the noise, the dust, and even the sight of us working were apparently unbearable. Her words stung, but I tried to brush them off. People can be particular about their neighborhoods, right? I figured she'd vent, maybe glare at us for a bit, and then leave. But Karen wasn't done yet. She stood there, arms crossed, glaring at us like we were invaders instead of workers just trying to do our jobs. That's when things took a turn I couldn't have predicted. Without warning, Karen marched back to her car, opened the trunk, and grabbed a can of red paint. Yes, paint. Who carries paint around in their car? Before anyone could react, she hurled it toward my crew. The can burst open midair, splattering bright red liquid everywhere. My foreman, Mike, stumbled backward, stunned. His hard hat dripped with paint, and his shirt looked like it belonged in a horror movie. Tools, walls, and even the ground were covered in streaks of crimson. For a moment, no one moved. Everyone was too shocked to speak. Then, slowly, anger started bubbling up inside me. How dare she? How dare she march onto someone else's property and destroy hours of hard work? I stepped forward, blocking her path as she tried to walk away. "Are you serious right now?" I asked, my voice shaking. Karen didn't apologize. She didn't even look sorry. Instead, she smirked, like she'd won some twisted game. "You'll regret this," she said before climbing into her fancy SUV and driving off. That's when I realized this wasn't just about a ruined workday. This was personal, and I wasn't going to let her get away with it. After Karen drove off, leaving behind a mess of red paint and chaos, I stood there for a moment, trying to process what had just happened. My crew was frozen in place, staring at the destruction around them. Tools lay scattered on the ground, now speckled with red. The freshly painted siding of the house looked like it had been attacked by an angry artist, and Mike, my foreman, still wore his paint-splattered hard hat like a bizarre badge of shame. I took a deep breath, forcing myself to focus. Losing my temper wouldn't help anyone. Instead, I turned to my team. "Is everyone okay?" I asked, my voice steady despite the storm brewing inside me. They nodded slowly, though their expressions told me they were as shaken as I was. No one said a word. It was as if we were all waiting for someone else to make sense of what had just unfolded. Then reality hit. This wasn't just about ruined clothes or wasted paint. It was about respect. Respect for us, for our work, and for the effort we put into doing our jobs every single day. What Karen did wasn't just rude. It was an attack. She didn't care about rules, permits, or fairness. All she cared about was her own idea of perfection, and she was willing to destroy anything that didn't fit her vision. With that thought burning in my mind, I pulled out my phone and hit record. Every second mattered now. I walked around the property, capturing everything. The streaks of red dripping down the walls, the tools lying abandoned in puddles of paint, and my crew standing silently amidst the wreckage. I zoomed in on Mike's hard hat, making sure the camera caught every detail. Then I approached Mrs. Jenkins, the elderly woman who lived next door. She'd been watching the whole thing from her porch, her eyes wide with disbelief. "Did you see what happened?" I asked, keeping my tone polite but urgent. She nodded vigorously. "Oh yes," she said, clutching her sweater. "That woman came out of nowhere and threw paint everywhere. It was awful." Her voice trembled with indignation, and I could tell she was as shocked as we were. But more importantly, she confirmed something crucial. She had seen everything. "Do you have a security camera?" I asked hopefully. Mrs. Jenkins nodded again. "Yes, I installed a Ring doorbell last year. I'll check the footage right away." Relief washed over me. If her camera had captured the incident, we'd have undeniable proof of Karen's actions. While Mrs. Jenkins went inside to retrieve the video, I called the police. Reporting the incident felt surreal, like I was living in some strange movie where nothing made sense anymore. But this wasn't fiction. It was real life, and I needed to protect my crew. As I waited for the authorities to arrive, I replayed the events in my head. Why had Karen done this? Was it really about the aesthetic of the neighborhood, or was there something deeper driving her behavior? Maybe she felt entitled because of her status or wealth, or maybe she simply enjoyed wielding power over others. Whatever the reason, her actions spoke volumes about who she was, and none of it was good. When the police finally arrived, they were professional but cautious. 2 officers stepped out of their patrol car and approached me. "Can you explain what happened here?" one of them asked, glancing at the mess. I recounted the story as calmly as I could, showing them the photos and videos I'd taken. They listened intently, jotting down notes, before asking to speak with my crew and Mrs. Jenkins. By then, Mrs. Jenkins had retrieved the footage from her Ring doorbell. The video was crystal clear, capturing every detail of Karen's tantrum. You could see her grabbing the paint can from her trunk, hurling it toward my crew, and smirking as she walked back to her SUV. Watching it made my blood boil all over again, but I forced myself to stay composed. This wasn't the time for emotion. It was the time for action. The officers reviewed the footage, their expressions growing darker with each passing second. "This is serious," one of them muttered under his breath. Serious indeed. Armed with evidence and witnesses, I knew we had a strong case against Karen. But as the initial shock began to wear off, doubt crept in. Would the system take this seriously? Or would Karen's charm and confidence sway people to her side? Only time would tell, but I was determined to fight. For my crew, for justice, and for the principle that no one should get away with such reckless behavior. As the police continued their investigation, I couldn't help but feel a mix of emotions swirling inside me. Anger, frustration, and even a little fear. This wasn't how my day was supposed to go. I had woken up that morning thinking about deadlines and blueprints, not about dealing with someone who seemed intent on ruining everything we'd worked for. But here we were, standing in the middle of a crime scene, trying to make sense of something that felt completely senseless. The officers finished speaking with my crew and Mrs. Jenkins, then turned their attention back to me. "We'll need to file a report," one of them said, his tone professional but firm. "And depending on the evidence, this could lead to charges." Charges. The word hung in the air like a storm cloud. Part of me wanted to jump at the idea of holding Karen accountable, but another part couldn't shake the nagging worry. What if she fought back? What if she tried to twist the story or discredit us? After all, people like her often had resources and connections that could make life difficult for those who stood in their way. But I didn't have time to dwell on worst-case scenarios. The immediate priority was cleaning up the mess Karen had left behind. My crew deserved better than to work in a space covered in paint and tension. So while the police wrapped up their initial assessment, I handed out clean rags and buckets of water. Together, we scrubbed walls, wiped down tools, and tried to salvage what we could. It was tedious, frustrating work, but it gave us something to focus on besides the chaos Karen had caused. As we cleaned, I noticed small moments of camaraderie among my team. Mike cracked a weak joke about his new look, pointing to his still-stained hard hat. Someone else muttered, "At least it's not boring around here," which earned a few chuckles. Laughter felt strange after everything that had happened, but it also reminded me why I loved working with these guys. They weren't just employees, they were family. And seeing them pull together, even in the face of absurdity, made me more determined than ever to protect them. Once the site was somewhat presentable again, I called the homeowner to explain what had happened. Thankfully, she was understanding, but understandably upset. "This is ridiculous," she said over the phone, her voice tinged with disbelief. "I hired you to fix the house, not deal with neighborhood drama." I agreed wholeheartedly. Still, she assured me that she supported pressing charges against Karen. Having her on our side felt like a small victory in an otherwise overwhelming situation. Later that evening, after sending the crew home early, I sat at my kitchen table reviewing everything we had gathered. The photos, the videos, the witness statements, it all painted a clear picture of what Karen had done. There was no denying her actions were reckless and malicious. Yet, as much as I wanted justice, I couldn't ignore the weight of what lay ahead. Legal battles are rarely quick or easy, and I knew this would take time, energy, and patience. That night, sleep eluded me. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw flashes of red paint and heard Karen's smug voice echoing in my mind. Her arrogance infuriated me, but it also fueled my resolve. If she thought she could intimidate me into backing down, she was wrong. I wasn't going to let her win. Not now. Not ever. By morning, I had made up my mind. This wasn't just about me or my crew anymore. It was about setting an example. For Karen, for the neighborhood, and for anyone else who might think they're above the rules. With the evidence in hand and the support of my team, I decided to move forward. Whatever came next, I was ready to face it head-on. The next day, I found myself sitting in a small, sterile room at the local police station, clutching a folder filled with evidence. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting an unforgiving glow on everything. The plain white walls, the scuffed linoleum floor, and the stack of papers in front of me. It felt surreal to be here, recounting the events of the past 24 hours as if they belonged to someone else's life. But this was my reality now, and I had to face it head-on. Karen had been summoned to the station too. When she walked in, she looked nothing like the furious woman who had hurled paint at my crew. Instead, she carried herself with an air of practiced calm, her designer clothes pressed and her hair perfectly styled. She didn't glance at me or acknowledge my presence, but I could feel her energy, cold, calculating, and self-assured. If she thought she could charm her way out of this, she clearly underestimated how much we had on her. The officers led us into separate rooms for questioning. I sat across from two detectives, both of whom seemed thorough and fair. They asked me to walk them through the incident step by step, which I did as clearly and concisely as possible. I showed them the photos and videos I'd taken, as well as the security footage Mrs. Jenkins had provided. Each piece of evidence painted a damning picture of Karen's actions, leaving little room for doubt about what had happened. When it was Karen's turn to speak, she spun a completely different story. According to her, she hadn't done anything wrong. In fact, she claimed we were the problem. "They were harassing me," she said, her voice trembling slightly, as though she were the victim. I felt unsafe and acted in self-defense. Self-defense. The idea was laughable. How could throwing paint at a group of workers possibly qualify as defending herself? Still, she stuck to her narrative, her tone dripping with manufactured sincerity. What surprised me most was how confident she seemed. She didn't flinch when the officers played the security footage, showing her grabbing the paint can and hurling it toward my crew. She didn't even blink. Instead, she leaned back in her chair, crossing her arms as if daring them to challenge her version of events. For a moment, I wondered if her bravado might actually work. What if the officers believed her over me? What if she managed to twist the truth so convincingly that no one would see through her lies? But then something incredible happened. As the footage played again, zooming in on Karen's face just before she threw the paint, her mask slipped. For a split second, you could see the anger, the entitlement, the sheer disregard for anyone but herself. It was subtle, but it was there, and the officers noticed. One of them raised an eyebrow, glancing at his partner. "Ma'am," he said slowly, "this doesn't look like self-defense." Karen's composure faltered. Her cheeks flushed red, and her polished demeanor cracked ever so slightly. She stammered, trying to explain away the obvious, but her words only dug her deeper into trouble. Watching her unravel gave me a strange sense of satisfaction. All her carefully crafted excuses couldn't erase the truth captured on camera. After hours of back and forth, the officers finally reached a decision. Karen was charged with vandalism and disorderly conduct. Hearing those words felt like a weight lifting off my shoulders, but I knew this was only the beginning. Pressing charges meant stepping into uncharted territory, a legal process full of uncertainty and challenges. Yet, despite the risks, I felt a renewed sense of purpose. This wasn't just about holding Karen accountable anymore. It was about standing up for what's right, even when it's hard. As I left the station that evening, the sun setting behind the buildings, I allowed myself a small smile. We had taken the first step toward justice, and no matter what came next, I was ready to keep fighting. The days following the police station visit were a whirlwind of activity. Pressing charges against Karen wasn't as simple as signing a piece of paper and walking away. It meant diving headfirst into a legal process that felt like navigating a maze without a map. I knew it wouldn't be easy, but I also knew I couldn't back down. Not now. Not after everything we'd been through. First, I met with a lawyer recommended by one of my friends. His name was Mr. Patel, a calm and methodical man who had years of experience handling cases like mine. Sitting in his office, surrounded by shelves lined with thick law books, I laid out every detail. The paint incident, the evidence we'd gathered, and Karen's behavior at the police station. He listened intently, nodding occasionally as he scribbled notes on a yellow legal pad. When I finished, he leaned back in his chair, tapping his pen against the desk. "This is a strong case," he said finally, "but don't underestimate how messy things can get. People like her often fight dirty." His words sent a chill down my spine, but they weren't entirely unexpected. Deep down, I'd known this wouldn't be straightforward. Still, hearing it aloud made the reality sink in even more. Over the next few weeks, my life revolved around preparing for court. My days started early, juggling work calls and construction deadlines, while squeezing in meetings with Mr. Patel. We went over every piece of evidence multiple times, ensuring nothing was overlooked. The photos, videos, and security footage became our backbone, the undeniable proof of Karen's actions. But beyond the tangible evidence, we also focused on the impact her behavior had caused. Delays in the project, emotional stress for my crew, financial losses, it all added up to paint a bigger picture of the damage she'd done. Meanwhile, Karen's defense team wasn't sitting idle. They filed motions, requested extensions, and tried every trick in the book to delay the proceedings. At one point, they even accused us of exaggerating the situation, claiming the paint incident was minor and didn't warrant legal action. Minor. I couldn't believe what I was reading. Apparently, ruining someone's property and throwing paint at people were just minor inconveniences in their eyes. Then came the depositions, a formal process where both sides questioned each other under oath. Facing Karen again was surreal. She sat across from me, flanked by her high-powered attorney, looking every bit the entitled woman I'd come to know. Her answers were rehearsed, almost robotic, as if she'd memorized them word for word. When asked why she threw the paint, she doubled down on her self-defense claim, insisting she'd felt threatened by my crew. The absurdity of it made my jaw tighten, but I forced myself to stay composed. Losing my temper wouldn't help anyone. What struck me most during those sessions was how disconnected Karen seemed from reality. To her, this was just another battle to win, a game where rules could be bent or broken depending on convenience. But to me, this was personal. Every lie she told, every excuse she made, only deepened my resolve to see this through. As the weeks turned into months, the stress began to wear on me. Sleepless nights became the norm, and there were moments when doubt crept in. What if the judge didn't side with us? What if Karen walked away scot-free? But then I'd think about my crew, their stained clothes, their stunned faces, and I'd remind myself why I was doing this. This wasn't just about me. It was about protecting them, about standing up for fairness in a world that sometimes seemed determined to crush it. One evening, after yet another long day of preparation, I sat on my porch staring at the stars. For the first time in weeks, I allowed myself to imagine the possibility of closure. If we won, it wouldn't just be a victory for us. It would send a message to anyone who thought they could act without consequences. Justice might take time, but it was worth fighting for. And no matter what happened, I knew I'd given it everything I had. The day of the trial finally arrived, and it felt like the air itself was charged with tension. I woke up early, my heart pounding as if it were trying to escape my chest. No matter how much I prepared, nothing could fully calm the nerves that came with stepping into a courtroom. This wasn't just any ordinary day. It was Judgment Day, the moment where everything we'd worked for would either fall into place or crumble apart. When I walked into the courthouse, the atmosphere was heavy with anticipation. The room buzzed softly with murmurs from spectators, neighbors curious about the drama, reporters eager for a story, and even a few members of my crew who had come to show their support. Karen sat across the aisle, looking every bit the picture of confidence. She wore an expensive suit and carried herself with the same air of superiority she'd displayed at the police station. Her attorney, a tall man with sharp features and an even sharper tone, whispered something in her ear, making her nod slightly. As the judge entered and called the court to order, the room fell silent. The proceedings began, and both sides presented their cases. My lawyer, Mr. Patel, stood first, laying out our argument with precision. He walked the jury through the events step by step, using the photos, videos, and security footage to paint a vivid picture of what had happened. When he played the video of Karen throwing the paint, you could hear gasps ripple through the courtroom. It was undeniable proof of her actions, and for a moment, I allowed myself to feel a flicker of hope. Then it was Karen's turn. Her attorney launched into a polished defense, attempting to cast doubt on everything we presented. He argued that Karen's actions were justified because she felt threatened, though he struggled to explain how a group of construction workers doing their job posed any real danger. He also tried to downplay the damage, calling it minimal and suggesting we were overreacting. But the more he talked, the less convincing his arguments seemed. Even the jury looked skeptical, exchanging glances as if silently agreeing that this whole thing was ridiculous. When it was my turn to testify, I took a deep breath and stepped onto the stand. The spotlight was on me now, and I knew I had to stay calm and focused. My lawyer guided me through my testimony, asking me to recount the incident and describe its impact on my crew and the project. I spoke honestly, letting the emotions behind the words show without losing control. I talked about the shock and frustration my team felt, the delays caused by cleaning up Karen's mess, and the toll it took on everyone involved. By the time I finished, I could see nods of understanding from some of the jurors. They were listening, not just to the facts, but to the human side of the story. Karen testified too, sticking to her rehearsed script. She claimed she acted out of fear, her voice trembling theatrically as she described feeling intimidated by my crew. But her performance didn't land the way she'd hoped. Under cross-examination, her answers grew shaky, especially when confronted with the security footage. There was no escaping the truth captured on camera, and the cracks in her story began to show. After hours of testimony and deliberation, the judge instructed the jury to reach a verdict. Waiting for their decision felt like an eternity. Every second stretched longer than the last, and I found myself gripping the edge of my seat, my mind racing with possibilities. Would they see through Karen's lies, or would her charm and resources tip the scales in her favor? Finally, the foreman stood up, holding the verdict slip. As he read it aloud, "Guilty on all counts," a wave of relief washed over me. Justice had been served. Karen was ordered to pay restitution for the damages, complete community service, and issue a formal apology. While the victory didn't erase what had happened, it gave us closure and affirmed that accountability matters. Walking out of the courthouse that evening, I felt lighter, as if a weight I hadn't realized I was carrying had finally lifted. The fight wasn't easy, but it was worth it. And for the first time in months, I allowed myself to believe that things could go back to normal, or at least as close to normal as possible after such a wild chapter in our lives. Winning the case against Karen felt like crossing the finish line of a marathon I hadn't planned to run. It was exhausting, but there was also a strange sense of pride in knowing we'd made it through. Still, life didn't magically return to normal after the trial. The battle had left its mark, on me, on my crew, and even on the neighborhood. But slowly, piece by piece, things began to heal. For starters, the renovation project finally got back on track. With Karen out of the picture and no more unexpected disruptions, my team worked tirelessly to make up for lost time. The house transformed beautifully, from its freshly painted exterior to the updated plumbing inside. Every nail hammered and every brushstroke applied felt like reclaiming something Karen had tried to take away. Our dignity, our work ethic, and our peace of mind. When the homeowner saw the finished product, she hugged me tightly, thanking us for persevering despite everything. In that moment, I realized how much this victory meant, not just to me, but to others who believed in fairness and hard work. The neighborhood dynamic shifted too. Word spread about what had happened, and while some people avoided taking sides, many stepped forward to show their support. Mrs. Jenkins, whose security footage had been pivotal, baked cookies for my crew and left them on the job site with a note that read, "Thank you for standing up." Even neighbors who had once kept to themselves stopped by to chat or offer kind words. Some admitted they'd been intimidated by Karen's behavior in the past, but were inspired by how we handled the situation. It was as if her downfall gave everyone permission to breathe a little easier, to feel safer in their own community. Of course, not everything changed overnight. There were still moments when doubt crept in. What if Karen decided to retaliate? What if someone else tried to throw their weight around? But those fears gradually faded as time passed. Instead, I focused on the lessons I'd learned from the experience. I discovered strength I didn't know I had, resilience that came from standing firm even when it felt impossible. And most importantly, I learned the power of unity, how coming together as a team, a neighborhood, or a community can overcome even the toughest challenges. As for Karen, she disappeared from the spotlight almost entirely. Rumor had it she moved to another part of town, though no one seemed particularly eager to keep tabs on her. Occasionally, I hear whispers about her struggling to adjust to life without the influence she once wielded. Good, I thought. Maybe it would teach her a lesson about humility and respecting others. Now, whenever I drive past that renovated house, I can't help but smile. It's not just because it turned out so well. It's because it reminds me of where we started and how far we've come. That house stands as a symbol of perseverance, justice, and the idea that sometimes doing the right thing requires fighting for it. Looking back, I'm glad I didn't back down. Sure, it was messy and stressful, but it taught me something invaluable. Standing up doesn't mean you won't get knocked down. It means you'll get back up every time. Life isn't always fair, but when you fight for what's right, you give yourself, and those around you, a chance to create a better story.